This is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. This edition of AR features Christopher Simpson on Science of Coercion, Psychological Warfare. During the Cold War, a battle raged for control of people's minds. U.S. military, intelligence, and propaganda agencies saw mass communication as an instrument of persuasion and domination. To further their ideological and political goals, they recruited and enlisted top professors and universities. That relationship between the government and the academy shaped not only the research agendas of social scientists, but also their conclusions. The legacy was profound and continues. The academic studies provided an important part of U.S. psychological warfare, not just internationally, but domestically as well. They aided in framing the widely held preconceptions that persist today in communication studies, public opinion research, and in the types of counterinsurgency operations known as public diplomacy and low-intensity conflict. Christopher Simpson is professor of communications at American University in Washington, D.C. He's the recipient of major awards for historical writing and investigative reporting. He's the author of the classic Blowback, America's Recruitment of Nazis, and The Splendid Blond Beast, Money, Law, and Genocide in the 20th Century. His latest book is Science of Coercion. I talked with Christopher Simpson in Washington. Chris, what was the range and scope of United States psychological warfare programs during World War II?
Well, that's where it really got its start in a big way, in an institutionalized sort of way. There were 6 main programs at that time, and one of the interesting things about them is the extent to which psychological warfare of that time was closely interwoven with both the top publications and radio stations, the existing mass media of the country of that particular era, and also with the academics of that time, the big universities, the big university think tanks. During the Second World War is where this sort of interwoven group of people who were experts or at least practitioners in psychological warfare, they really met one another and started to think more or less along the same lines. And those connections carried through well into the 1970s. But going back into the Depression years, you had the big foundations already were identifying social science as a mechanism or as a tool for social control. For example, on the eve of World War II, the Rockefeller Foundation bankrolled a series of meetings among the leading lights, or what the Rockefellers saw as the leading lights of communication research, sociology, and so forth. These are scientists who focus on ideology in one way or another, on what is ideology, how do you manipulate people's ideology, how do you get them to do what you would like them to do. And so the Rockefeller Foundation was already onto this by the late 1930s, and there were some other think tanks that were even earlier than that. But in terms of the government sponsorship, of the bringing together of state power and social science techniques to move people, to influence their behavior, that sort of thing, that really started during World War II.
But even before World War II, in the private sector at least, you had the doyen of Madison Avenue, Edward Bernays, talking about manipulating public opinion. You had the legendary journalist Walter Lippmann talking about elite management of public opinion and the manufacture of consent.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And when you, in the book, I go back and look at really some of the deeper roots of all this. There were psychological warfare agencies although not called by that name, working during World War I. That's where Walter Lippmann got his start. He's, a big intellectual of this century, and his thinking about what communication is was shaped in very basic ways by his experience as a propagandist and as an intelligence officer during World War I. Those were among his most important formative experiences. I'd like to go into something else, though, for a moment. See, what's happening here, at least for me, is it's a deeper question than just, were all these guys in it together, and did they come up with techniques for selling automobiles or selling, Eisenhower or politicians, whatever. It goes deeper than that. What this is about is, where do ideas come from? Why is it that we think of communication as basically something that's done to us? Right? You go to any school of communication, college of journalism, that sort of thing, in the country today, and what they train students in is how to shape people's behavior and their ideology. And in some cases this is done through public relations, and then there's sort of a different spin on it that has to do with journalism and so forth and so on. But the point is that just about everybody takes it for granted that when you talk about communication, you're talking about giving somebody directions, right? Making somebody else do what you want them to do. And if there's any listening involved at all, it's listening only insofar as, well, how do I find out about what makes that person tick in order to get them to do what I want them to do, right? In order to manufacture their consent to my particular program. That idea of communication, and remember, we're talking about something really basic here, communication. I mean, this is like the fabric of culture. It's the actual substance of how do men and women relate to each other. How do black people relate to white people? On and on and on. How do white people relate to white people? Okay. We come at that question with the presumption that what society is about is giving orders and taking orders. But if you think about communication, there are different ways to conceive of it. And an example of this can be found right in the word itself, communication. The root ideas there are, if you look at com, that's a Latin word for together, for a burden, something that you carry, and unia, in other words, together. The root of the idea, when it started in English, I'm talking about 600-700 years ago now, before the bourgeois rise of the bourgeois culture, communication meant sharing burdens. It meant common culture. It meant how do we find ways to work together. Now, I mean, let's be realistic about this. This is feudal Europe. It's not like, we were living in this wonderful utopia and everybody got along and so forth. But still, the basic conception of where ideas came from was quite different. Ideas came from us. They were worked out among us, as distinct from being worked out by a think tank at a university or in the government somewhere and then told to us, and then we sort of survive as best we can with that kind of hierarchical structure. Okay. What this science did was to come up with ways to define the way that we train ideological experts in ways that they would accept and reinforce the hierarchical structures of society. The What they did was, I mean, in the real world, there is such a thing as hierarchical structures, right? I mean, there is such a thing as people who give orders and so forth and so on. But that's only one form of communication. That's only one type. It's a type that's particularly pronounced in the society that we have. But it's only one approach to all of this. What happened with these government programs was that type of communication was given funding, encouragement, access to the academic journals, appointments in the universities, backing to create think tanks, and on and on and on, so that became enormously developed and sophisticated. And other ideas about communication were either allowed to wither, or they were denounced or made fun of, and so on. And this is how the mainstream ideas about this really basic idea, communication, this is where they came from.
So you're suggesting that this science, communication, became a vehicle for ideology and propaganda?
Sure, certainly one of the vehicles. I'm not suggesting that it is the only one, but I think it's an interesting case study. It's because it's clear-cut. These types of communication theories really came into their own starting in the mid-1950s. It was at that point that you started to have, a whole series of academic journals. You had professors of this, PhDs in this, and so forth and so on. So you ask yourself, okay, well, why in the 1950s? Why not in the 1930s? Why not in the 1990s? What was going on that brought this to pass? And so what I did in this book is I went and looked at that question and went into the archives. And what I discovered was that at that time you had about a half a dozen big think tanks that really specialized in this stuff. These were places like the Bureau of Applied Social Research at Columbia University, a very famous place for those who track sociology, Center for International Studies at MIT, and so forth and so on. Okay, they had gotten their start during World War II as pretty much as agencies, or no, not agencies, as outposts of the federal government. That's where their funding came from. Some of them were getting secret funding, actually illegal funding, from the Department of State. All right. But they were going bankrupt into 1948, 1949, that general time frame. It's because they couldn't sustain themselves. They simply didn't have enough backing. Well, what happened? Starting in late 1949 and early 1950, a ocean of money from government intelligence agencies and the Pentagon started to flow into these think tanks, and soon made up 50%, 75%, in some cases 95% of the annual budget of the main organizations that were studying things like advertising, morale studies. How do you maintain morale of people inside a big organization? Persuasion, coercion. What is the impact of disasters or violence on people's behavior? Interrogation. How do you convince people to do things? I mean, for example, does scaring somebody with an atrocity story work better to get them to do what you want them to do, or is it better to tell them a nice story and try to, sort of bring them along? Okay, that research was bankrolled by these government agencies almost exclusively from the late 40s through the 1950s, and the products of that research, reports, studies, books, and so on, became the foundation for this field, and are remembered today among people who track this particular field as the founding documents and the founding fathers and so forth and so on of communication studies.
One of them you identify as Hadley Cantrell of the Institute for International Social Research at Princeton. Apparently he was directly on the CIA payroll.
Absolutely. The agency paid him a grant of $1 million in, it was 1955 or 1956, that his co-author and assistant, a man by the name of Lloyd Free, eventually confirmed in an interview. Cantrell was a social psychologist and rather influential in both the fields of psychology and public opinion research. And his job was to go to countries that were seen as problematic by the CIA and figure out, well, what is the social psychology? What's the atmosphere there as far as attitudes about Americans? What countries? France, Italy, Poland, Soviet Union, and then later going into a variety of third world or so-called developing countries. Same story. Now, he would present himself as a public opinion researcher, as an academic, and so forth. And there were certainly academic aspects to what he was doing. The point, however, is that what was going on in Cantrell's case and in other cases as well was the creation of a database of information, a library of information whose function to the government was protecting imperialism. That's what the government got out of this. That's why they were paying the bills. Something interesting happened in academe parallel with this, and that was that the same library of information also became the foundation for a school of social science that we've been teaching to our children for the last 30 years now.
Well, what did these lords and barons of communication research, you mentioned Hadley Cantrell and Paul Lazarsfeld and Wilbur Schramm and others, why did they become knowing agents and instruments for U.S. power?
That's a complicated question, and it varies from case to case. I mean, in some cases it has something to do with a person's individual psychology. In some cases their politics, and so forth and so on. I go through that question in some detail, but there are a couple different things. One thing is these people were largely political liberals. You know, when we think of the Cold War, there's a tendency to think of, Joseph McCarthy and so forth. These people, in contrast, and this is also true of the big foundations of the period, adopted Cold War tactics and Cold War imperialism actually as a way of legitimizing themselves in the fight against McCarthy, okay? And McCarthy-type people, not just McCarthy alone. In the U.S., you had this powerful extreme right-wing reaction that wanted to purge academe of anybody who anybody who was Jewish, for heaven's sakes, anybody who had a secular point of view, certainly African Americans to the extent that they existed in academia, and so forth and so on. So liberal intellectuals picked up Cold War propaganda as a way of defending themselves from these kind of attacks. Now, meanwhile, the CIA, which there's a tendency to think of the CIA as fascist or Nazi. Well, I think the reality is much more complicated than that. The CIA, particularly during the 1950s, was seen as a liberal stronghold, not a McCarthyite stronghold. And in fact, McCarthy tried to purge the CIA. So what was the liberal idea? The liberal idea is that there's better ways to carry out, protect, and exploit an empire than just sending soldiers and guns, right? They wanted to send, lawyers, guns, and money. I mean, to the phrase, and more than just lawyers, guns, and money. They also wanted to send psychologists, sociologists, academics, people who could go into Chile, go into the Philippines, psych out what the popular attitudes were. There's a good example in the Philippines. There was a very serious rebellion against a U.S.-backed regime that had collaborated with the Japanese during World War II. the Huck Rebellion in the Philippines. All right. Well, a key part of the American strategy there was to send in advertising specialists, psychological warfare specialists, academics, and they would go in and they would do surveys of the Philippine population. And they would try to identify, well, what are myths that people feel? What are their attitudes towards power, their attitudes towards the United States, the Soviet Union, and so forth, and use this data to develop campaigns that, on the one hand, would terrify people into supporting the American candidates, and on the other hand, give them rationalizations, explanations, sort of feel-good reasons to support these same candidates. This is the way that people like Marcos came to power. When the Americans installed repressive regimes in developing countries, in Guatemala, all these places, they didn't come in and say, here, we're going to give you a big dose of Joseph McCarthy. In most cases, certainly during the 1950s, it was, oh, we're bringing you into the 20th century. We're going to bring you democracy. We're going to bring you prosperity, and so forth and so on. That's the first promise. And then the second, the flip side of exactly that tactic was terror. Terror aimed at those who objected to the imposition of these regimes. Terror in the form of counterinsurgency, police operations, assassinations, this type of thing. What sociologists did in all this was to articulate a series of ideas and strategies whereby the Americans could go into a country that they didn't really understand very well and hit the ground running, so to speak. Right. You know, they learned some of these ideas from the Nazis who had tried this in the occupied areas of Soviet Union during World War II. They learned some of this stuff from the British and French who tried some of this in maintaining their empires. They stumbled around and learned a little bit through the Civil War in Greece, where they intervened on the side of a reactionary government. By the time they got to the Philippines, this was pretty sophisticated. They had regular manuals, regular designs about how to manufacture consent in the Philippines. Now, by the mid-1950s, you had the foundation of a center at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose specific function was to come up with these types of strategies that could be sort of plugged in to countries all around the world. And this was called the Center for International Studies. It was led by a guy who was the CIA's research director, essentially, intelligence director. He retired out of the agency. He went to MIT and set up this think tank. So they would go, like, for example, they had big studies of all of the countries around the periphery of the Soviet Union, big studies of the countries in the Middle East that had oil wealth and so forth. And they would use this intelligence to carry out American propaganda, covert operations, police training, and so forth.
Earlier you mentioned the Bureau of Applied Social Research, BASR, at Columbia University. You call it, quote, perhaps the single most influential center of social science research during the Cold War. There's a couple of activities it engaged in that I'd like you to discuss in detail, if you would. One is it collaborated with the CIA's testing of LSD on human subjects, and the second is its scientists, the BASR scientists, recommended to the Pentagon that it use World War II Nazi collaborators within the Soviet Union, including many who were implicated and involved in mass murders of Jews, in a plan to subvert the Soviet Union.
That's true, and there's another aspect of the BASR studies that most people don't understand that is worth some note, and that has to do with strategy for nuclear war. So why don't I start with that one? One question is, well, where do we get our ideas about what nuclear war means? You know, most of us have never seen a nuclear explosion. Where do these ideas come from? Well, during the 1950s, there were one of the things that BASR did was to study natural disasters, such as hurricanes and earthquakes and so forth, for the Army Chemical Warfare Agency, for the purpose of determining how do groups of people respond to massive disasters. The Army Chemical Warfare Agency, obviously this wasn't just like a intellectual exercise for them. They wanted to know what happens if you drop chemical weapons on an urban population, right? Well, the Army already knew individually, you take an individual and you expose them to so much mustard gas and these sorts of physiological reactions. Okay. But when you happen with a group of people, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. It's because, do people come together to protect themselves? Do they start fighting amongst each other? Does it set off race riots? Who knows what happens? Okay. So, BASR's first task was to try to understand what this would mean in the context of chemical warfare. And they did such a great job that they went on to new contracts to try to understand what these urban dynamics would mean in the context of nuclear warfare. Now, so that's what they were selling to the government. On the academic side of things, what they were doing is putting together a series of ideas about what's the sociology of cities. How do cities work? Right? It's a legitimate question, and it's an important question. But the point here is the whole focus and point of how the question was asked, who was asking the question, what type of results were between the lines of their answers. All of that was done for a specific purpose, for a specific contract, i.e., teaching the government how to use its nuclear weapons more effectively. So you go back and look in the academic literature and you see, urban dynamics. Well, that sounds pretty reasonable, sounds pretty scientific. You go into the military literature and what you see is discussions about waging of war, counterinsurgency warfare, so-called low-intensity warfare, and so on. These things were two sides of a single coin. Now, to go on to the other points that you raised, in the Nazi collaborators, what that was about is that the Western Allies, in fact, all the Allies, captured warehouses full of Nazi records when Hitler's government in Berlin fell, and starting in the late 1940s, they set up very large-scale plan or programs to systematically go through those records and learn what could be learned about fighting the Soviet Union from the Nazis' experience of doing that. Now, if you think back to your World War II history, you'll know that one of the central character of the Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union was extermination. All right? This was not a military campaign, or it was only secondarily a military campaign. This was quite explicitly in terms of, those people who track this stuff are familiar with the orders by General Manstein and certain SS orders and so forth and so on. The point, or certainly a major point, of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was first of all to exterminate Jews, second of all to exterminate so-called commissars, i.e. communists. And over the longer haul, to either exterminate or drive out Slavic peoples of all sorts, Russians, Ukrainians, and so forth, so to create so-called living space for Germany. That was the character of the German occupation of the Soviet Union. It wasn't a for one thing, it wasn't legal under international law. It wasn't in any sense humane as far as the population's point of view, right? It was essentially a mass murder program. Well, the Americans systematically interviewed the ideologues, the thinkers, the intellectuals, the generals, the colonels, the police chiefs, the collaborators who worked in these programs, and so forth, and of course their records, all through the late 1940s and 1950s, to try to get hints about how it is do you attack and occupy the Soviet Union. There was an explicit nuclear side of all this as well. I mean, the thinking, you can read this in the war contingency plans. It's really quite explicit. They say, okay, well, the number of nuclear bombs or weapons of different types changed as the decade went on. It's because the weapons got, first of all, there's more of them, and they were bigger, and so forth. But the basic concept remained the same. The Western Allies were going to go flying in there, basically with bombers, drop atomic bombs on somewhere between 30 and 300 Soviet targets, depending upon how many, at what point in the decade the plan was made, devastate the population, atomic weapons, they're very inaccurate. They rely upon mass killings of civilians. That's how they work, and particularly how they worked in the 1950s. All right, devastate these populations, and then they were going to come flying in there with various Soviet emigres and refugees who had come to the West after 1945 and set those guys and women up as new governments inside the Soviet Union. And this, supposedly, was how they were going to fight a war with the Soviets.
Then you had Dulles' whole rollback theory in 1953.
Absolutely. And in fact, rollback was offered to the Pentagon in a compromise in which the Americans would not go to war, would not stage a nuclear strike, or as it was termed at the time, a preventative war against the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. And instead they would try these covert and semi-covert methods to roll back communism. Rollback was, in the national security centers of government, a peaceful, quote-unquote, option, something short of nuclear war. And the idea in 1952 was, well, if rollback doesn't work, then we can always try the big one. So anyway, getting on back to the Bureau of Applied Social Research, the job of that think tank, and there were other think tanks. There's a Russian research center at Harvard that was involved in this process as well, and also a center at Princeton and so on. The function of these think tanks was to identify targets in the Soviet Union, collect intelligence, collect economic intelligence, political, cultural intelligence, try to understand the social psychology that operated there, where the communication centers are, and on and on and on, for the purpose of more efficiently carrying out this war. And finally, onto the LSD question. The LSD program was it was a special program, and it says a couple different things, both about how they saw communication, what this meant, what that word meant, and what they were willing to do with it. One of the things that the CIA was very interested in was, could drugs be used as a form of interrogation and social manipulation? And so this is well known. I'm not the first one to come up with this. Marty Lee and some others have written whole books about how these CIA programs work, and good books. The idea was that you could use LSD as a tool to interrogate spies. At one point, there was even an idea to use LSD plus electroshock therapy, so that when somebody retired from the CIA who maybe knew too much, they would run him through electroshock therapy and wipe his mind clean. I mean, this is how extreme it became. All right. That's where the LSD experiments started, and some of them involved clear crimes. I mean, giving massive doses, 200 and 300 times the dose that people will take for entertainment these days, giving that to a psychotic patient, basically to see what the patient would do, right? Is like guinea pigs. All right. That was mainly done by doctors, okay? BASR were made up largely of social scientists. So BASR's contribution to this was to send a man by the name of Leonard to participate or to monitor, take part in some of these experiments. And his particular bent on all this is, well, what does drug use do when it's done socially, when a group of people do it? Okay? And they were, Leonard was exploring something that was called, revealingly to me, the stablemate concept, okay? And this compared people to horses. And the idea was, okay, we've got two horses in a stable. And one of the horses is in distress in some way, okay, is vulnerable. Well, that horse is going to follow the horse that is not in distress. So the CIA's idea was, okay, we'll take a defector, we'll take somebody that we want to control, we'll take a politician, we'll take Fidel Castro, whoever, load him up with drugs, sit him down in, particularly LSD, sit him and induce psychosis was the thinking. Sit him down with a psychiatrist and then lead that person around to the American or the CIA's point of view as a result of this drug experience. Well, one thing they discovered is it didn't work quite the way that they had hoped it would. But the point is that they certainly tried it, and in fact did dozens of experiments to try to work out a technique that would actually work. Again, this gets back to this business of sort of liberal thinking, the role of science in constructing an imperial empire. The idea here was, I mean, from the CIA's point of view, was that this was a rational way to deal with the Fidel Castros of the world, right? Why send in the 82nd Airborne if you could kidnap the guy, fill him full of drugs, and get him to sabotage his own revolution? Okay, very clever. That there's a word in management circles for that. It's called rationalization, and what that means is you take a production process, in this case the production and maintenance of empire, and you do it more rationally. You do it more efficiently, less waste, less confusion, less stepping on your own shoelaces. And that is what the intellectuals brought to imperial empire in the 1950s, that form of rationalization.
In describing these experiments in the 40s and 50s, it certainly resonates with the information that's coming out today about radiation experiments on equally vulnerable populations, prisoners and the infirmed and the like, in this case conducted by medical people, doctors and their staffs.
Sure. And again, to touch on the Nazi experience, if you look at the history of National Socialism, you see there, too, major roles played by intellectuals, doctors, PhDs, and so on. You know, I'm not anti-intellectual, but I do think, I mean, for heaven's sakes, I teach in a university, you know, but I do think that we need to speak frankly and to try to dispel some of the myths that surround what intellectuals do.
And when you talk about imperialism and empire and propaganda, these are, at least in the conventional wisdom, these are attributes of our adversaries, of our enemies. It's not attributes of the United States.
Right, and you know that's another very interesting thing about this field, communication research, because they were quite active in making those kind of definitions. You know, people might remember more recently that Jeane Kirkpatrick, speaking at the United Nations, was saying that there's a difference between a totalitarian government, i.e. Hungary, you know, well-known totalitarian bad guy, or Czechoslovakia, I'm talking about before 89, and an authoritarian government. Now, authoritarian governments supposedly were nicer. Pinochet was supposedly nicer than the Czech government. Well, you know, you can take that for what it's worth. The question is well, where did that structure come from? Where did that idea start? And it can be traced very explicitly. There were a series of pamphlets prepared for the U.S. Information Agency in the early 1950s by a man by the name of Wilbur Schramm. Schramm is the big founding father of this whole field, practically, and most people in the field just kind of roll over and wag their feet in the air when Wilbur Schramm's name is mentioned. Schramm wrote a series of studies about propaganda where he put forward the claim that there was this difference, a moral difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and authoritarianism was supposedly nicer. Now, there were a variety of problems with that, not least of which is that neither of those words describe very fully different types of oppression and brutality that exist in the world today. And second of all, in Schramm's own analysis of, well, what is it that makes the Hungarian communication system different than the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, for example? Well, you go and you read his study and you look at his footnotes. And his footnotes, you can track them right out, were studies that were themselves created, commissioned, and so forth in psychological warfare operations that the government had put together in the early 50s. So what pattern do you see? You see the CIA and the Air Force and so on putting together academics, mainly at Stanford University, but at other places too, saying to them, go tell us what the Soviets are and how they work. Okay, and so they write up these relentlessly hostile analyses of the Soviet Union. And you know, I want to say clearly that there's some element of truth to these analyses. We're talking about Stalin-era Soviet Union. But they were nonetheless misleading in some fundamental ways. All right, so that happens in 1950, 1951, 52. The big misleading thing here was to take the, Marxism-Leninism has a doctrinal commitment to world revolution. It's written in the books, it's written in the Constitution of the Soviet Union, so forth and so on. Okay. What the intellectuals did was to take that doctrinal commitment to revolution and say that, therefore, if you see a communist in a labor union somewhere, or if you see a communist in a national liberation movement, that therefore that means that the labor union and the national liberation movement and so forth and so on is all part of one big international communist conspiracy that's going to take over the world, so that the misinformation about the threat, quote unquote, in Guatemala, instead of being recognized as misinformation, becomes further proof of the threat, quote unquote, in France, or further proof of the threat, quote unquote, in Greece, and so forth and so on, all down the line. All right, so where does Schramm fit into this? Well, Schramm takes those studies and says, well, I'm going to make a higher level, more theoretical analysis of all this, and it is on the basis of that raw material that he comes up with this distinction between authoritarian governments and totalitarian governments. He confounds, or he sticks together disinformation and misinformation in such a way that it advanced American foreign policy interests, particularly the U.S. Information Agency, which was paying the bill in this particular case, which advanced their interest at that juncture of the Cold War.
Another area which has a sort of a contemporary resonance is this notion of plausible deniability. An early National Security Council directive created the Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC, inside the CIA, and this has a rather interesting history to it, but it was designed to provide plausible deniability. What was the OPC, and how did it factor into this whole equation?
The OPC was the father of the covert operations side of the CIA. Okay, the CIA has a couple different sides. One is information analysis, right? Others covert operations, political operations, manipulating newspapers and politicians and labor unions around the world. That stuff.
Is this the distinction you make between white and black propaganda?
No, not exactly. Not exactly. White and black propaganda. Well, let's deal with the OPC first, and then come back to white and black propaganda. OPC's mission was covert operations, to manipulate people, to undermine the supposed enemies of American people, and to build up the supposed friends. One interesting operation that the OPC really spearheaded was the creation of something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which throughout the 1950s, throughout the 1960s, was a very influential voice, bankrolled by the CIA, among intellectuals in academia and think tanks and so forth, pushing for intensified Cold War, pushing for intervention in Vietnam, pushing for maintenance of great coldness and tension between the Americans and the Soviets. Congress for Cultural Freedom, if you go back and look at who's on their board and so forth, its board was made up of many of the leading intellectuals of the day, often in the social sciences, also novelists and so on. That OPC was quite conscious of its role in manufacturing consent. It set out and spent tens of millions of dollars on that task. It organized and trained people for that specific function, both in terms of dealing with American audiences and international audiences. That's where the CIA cut its teeth. The stuff that, it always surprises me, that whatever the latest CIA scandal is, you see it in the newspapers or on television, and you got Tom Brokaw kind of breathlessly saying that the Americans intervened in the Polish election or something. The Americans have been intervening in the Polish election since 1945. Using pretty much the same people, using pretty much the same techniques. It's not a big surprise anymore, guys. So the question becomes whether we, audiences, people, voters, however you want to say it, recognize the systemic character of these abuses, or whether we see them as kind of isolated accidents that the government has somehow made along the way. Was the assassination attempts, plural, on Fidel Castro, was that just some sort of kind of crazy thing that some wild guys in the CIA did? Or was that more or less a rational and even a predictable outcome of the tactics that the agency took as its mission? Again, to come back to the social science stuff, things like efforts to assassinate international leaders were advocated by, articulated in the sense of sort of laid out in game plans and all of that by social scientists starting as early as the 1930s. You got one of these a big thinker in the field, Harold Laswell, says in a Encyclopedia of Social Science study in the early 1930s that, propaganda has replaced other more primitive means of social control. So we need to develop propaganda and improve our techniques. And then the question comes, what do you mean by these techniques? And he says it. He lays it right out very explicitly. Economic coercion, assassination, instigating race riots, and so forth on down the line. Very clear examples of a smart guy, right, trying to think up ways to use society, use people's attitudes against themselves.
And the white and black propaganda.
White and black propaganda. Okay, there's different types of propaganda that psychological warfare, specialists talk about just to make it convenient to exchange ideas among themselves. Black propaganda is propaganda that, or an operation. I think it makes more sense to speak in terms of black operations, and this doesn't have anything to do with race, except maybe on some subconscious level, but it's an operation that the government completely denies. The government insists that it doesn't know anything about it, has nothing to do with it. This is where your plausible deniability comes in. When you put together a black operation, the attempted assassination of the Muslim religious leader in Lebanon, to use a recent example, the government entirely denies that it has anything to do with this. Okay. White propaganda or white operations are things that the government acknowledges, right? So the United States has the Voice of America, has the U.S. Information Agency. It sponsors visits to the U.S. by intellectuals from other countries. It sponsors police training and military training and so forth. All that is so-called white propaganda or white operations. And in between the two, you have gray propaganda or gray operations. And what that's about is when the government reaches out and tries to plant articles in or manipulate the content of media that pretends that it's independent from the U.S. government but is not in truth. Example of this is, say, for example, the content of the New York Times, at least during certain periods and certain types of content. I was listening to a talk just the other day by Seymour Hersh and Scott Armstrong, two very prominent journalists. Seymour Hersh worked at the New York Times for many years, and Scott worked at the Washington Post, and both told stories about how the senior editors at their publications would call up Henry Kissinger at 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon and say, "Henry, what do you think about this?" And Kissinger would sort of give them the spin of the day on the issue of the day. And that process, at least inside the walls of that particular editorial office, was relatively open. That's an example of gray propaganda. Kissinger, ostensibly the New York Times is independent of Henry Kissinger. In reality, in most cases, news does not appear there unless he's vetted it. I'm talking about the period when Kissinger was National Security Advisor and so on.
What do you envision as the role of communications in a democratic society?
That's a complicated question. I think that first and foremost we need to rethink what it is communication does and what democracy does. And I'll give you a good example of this. I was Mark Raskin, who's based here in Washington, tells an interesting story about, well, what is intelligence? There's different approaches to intelligence. I'm talking about political intelligence, CIA-style intelligence. In an elite version of society, well, what the argument is that, most people are too ignorant to know what's good for them, so the elites will figure out the tough questions on behalf of everybody else, and that they'll have a variety of secret agencies, a national security state, really, to both figure out what's on the good, what's good for everybody else, and to enforce that. That's one kind of communication. And that all of that has its own sort of logic to it in a certain sense. I mean, it's certainly, like we're paying taxes on the order of $80 or $90 billion a year to keep that approach to things running. Okay, another approach, a more democratic approach, is built on the idea that if people are to have democratic control of the government, they must know what the government is doing. And for democracy to actually be implemented, this type of secrecy needs to be dispensed with, or at a minimum cut back to the lowest possible amount, so that the people generally can, in fact, participate in the life of their country and of world society generally.
Since you deal primarily with government documents, declassified records, and the like, I'm interested to know why you stopped in 1960. Is there a particular reason?
1960 is a convenient cutoff point. I mean, what happens there is that I show the roots of the Vietnam War have already come into existence there. The policy of using the Cold War with the Soviets as a pretext for the looting of the Third World. That policy is pretty well established by that time. The personalities have demonstrated who they are, and so on. So simply to keep the project manageable, that's why I did it that way.
But as far as you know, there's yet more information hidden away about this.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it is true that this industry, this communication research, this particular division of academe has evolved since 1960, certainly, and has evolved in some interesting ways. This one of the ideas in the book that's more interesting to me is trying to figure out how is it that the thing that empire and imperialism and hierarchy, all this, it sort of looks so logical, right? You know, you read the newspapers, you go to school, you listen to your mom and dad, all that stuff. It has a certain sensibleness to it. Well, where does that come from? Where do those ideas come from? And to the extent that this book, works, it's an examination of how that process works in one particular field, social sciences. And I think if as people start to apply that same study approach to other fields, that they will continue to find interesting stuff about where ideology comes from and whose interests it serves.
My guest has been Christopher Simpson. He teaches at American University in Communications in Washington, D.C. He's the author of Blowback, The Splendid, Blond Beast. His new book is Science of Coercion, Communication Research, and Psychological Warfare, 1945-1960. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks, David.
You were just listening to Christopher Simpson on Science of Coercion, Psychological Warfare. I talked with him in Washington on April 14, 1994. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.